Welcome to On the Media's very first live stream ever.
Good afternoon, I'm Joe Baker, a member of the Delaware Tribe of Indians.
Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Punishment and Profit, an educational webinar series about the prison industry presented by Worth Rises and the Green Space. I'm Bianca Tylek, founder and executive director at Worth Rises, a nonprofit organization dedicated to dismantling the prison industry and ending the exploitation of those it touches. Each week, we'll be talking about the $80 billion prison industry in the United States through the lens of one sector. We'll be joined by advocates, activists, journalists, litigators, and educators, including many who have been directly impacted by incarceration themselves, to dissect the deeply entrenched ways that financial interests shape our criminal legal system in this country. For our inaugural episode today, we're going to be talking to many distinguished guests about architecture and construction, all of whom are intimately familiar with the building and bars that make up our prison system. A little later in the show, we'll be joined by Raphael Sperry, Eunisses Hernandez, and Deanna Van Buren. But first, I'd like to welcome Johnny Perez. Johnny is the Director of U.S. Programs for the National Religious Campaign Against Torture, an interfaith membership organization working to end U.S.-sponsored torture and cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment. He is one of the nation's leading advocates in the fight to end solitary confinement. Johnny, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Bianca. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks.
In the recent Worth Rises report, you told your story about surviving solitary. You had a powerful line that struck me. You wrote, "I questioned how such a space could even exist. Who conceived of it? Who designed it? Who built it? Who condemned me to it?" Can you say more about how your personal experience has shaped your thinking about the nation's punishment infrastructure?
Yeah, absolutely. Really good question. I'll say that my main takeaway, before I go into this, that the United States has an appetite for punishment and control, and that these carceral settings are a true manifestation of that. Right? We respond to punishment, we respond with punishment to public health problems like poverty, homelessness, mental health issues, even substance use. In my own experience, I was held in solitary for a total of 3 years for cannabis use. And yes, now this is at a time now where many states are actually legalizing the use. People who are currently incarcerated are actually still to this day being placed in solitary confinement as a result of using it. And today we even see COVID-19, right, where we've seen a huge increase in the use of solitary confinement as a result. I also added these designs are not by accident, that early prison designs like the Panopticon design by Jeremy Bentham and even Eastern State Penitentiary, where people were held in spaces only where the only light in your cell was the light that came through the ceiling, meant to kind of signify the eye of God, where you will have to repent for your sins. And I'll say that these designs were literally originally created to break, the human spirit and serve as weapons of architecture that still exist till today.
Wow. Clearly, prisons and jail design has had an incredible impact on mental health of the incarcerated. And you know this, you've done a tremendous amount of work. In fact, we met when you were working for the Mental Health Project at the Urban Justice Center. But it can also impact physical health, right? I'm thinking about the dozens of prisons built in Texas without air conditioning, which has led to fatal heat strokes time and time again. Like many other things, COVID-19 has magnified this issue. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, there's a lot of layers there. I think that COVID-19 has done a number of things to force us to rethink how we think society, and has also exposed many of the things that many of the advocates have been saying is wrong with the system, according to some. And I'll say, this appetite for punishment has led to the increase in the use of solitary confinement, which is a direct response to a public health issue. In June of 2020, Solitary Watch and the Unlock the Box campaign to end solitary confinement, they reported a 500% increase in the use of solitary as departments literally scrambled to contain the virus. I think about the work of Michelle Jones in Indiana, where she, led the fight against in the Indiana women's prison, where women were being held in solitary simply not because of what they did or breaking a rule violation, but because they simply had a fever. Not only Indiana, but we've seen a boom in the use of solitary across the country as a result. And I'll say that because people who are inside cannot socially distance, right? These spaces also serve as a hub for COVID-19 in the sense that, it's difficult to keep folks from transmitting it. And even now we're seeing people who are even held away from the population still contracting COVID-19 because we all share the same air, for lack of a better term.
You've been doing incredible work to end the torture of solitary confinement. Can you share a bit about the traction that you're getting, especially from the design community, if any, and why the fight to end solitary confinement is critical to the criminal justice movement?
That is a really good question. To answer the second part of your question first, the reason that is critical is because this is an issue that is actually happening right now. Right now, as we speak, there's people being held in solitary cells no bigger than your average parking lot or your average bathroom, 24 hours a day. The last meal is at 5 o'clock, if that. And if it's the holiday, your last meal might be at 3 o'clock, right? We get behind the idea of accountability, but when we see how it's actually manifested inside of these spaces, we see that it's actually not reflective of our shared values. So if we are going to end mass incarceration, we need to focus on all of the pieces of the puzzle, specifically what goes on inside, because the truth is that what happens inside of prison does not stay inside of prison. And you can ask COVID-19 about that. But really getting into the work, we work directly with solitary survivors and faith leaders across 15 different states. In 2019, right before the pandemic hit, there were 78 pieces of legislation that were introduced to end the practice. Some really huge successes. And this is all due to the people on the ground, on the front lines of this work. New Jersey, who passed a bill limiting solitary confinement to 20 days. We've seen successes around the country where we've limited solitary to a large degree. I'll say very recently in Connecticut, a huge win came in just over the last few days. And again, shout out to Leighton Johnson and those folks who are directly impacted on the front lines of that, where they actually closed the prison down in the state. I'll say specifically in terms of design, because I think Raphael Sperry, who you're going to go to later on, it can speak a little bit better to this, but we were able to support Raphael's work in convincing the American Institute of Architects to ban the designing of these spaces going to be used for torture. And it's really a big blow and a big hit for the movement, because it shows that even architects are coming together and saying, hey, this is not reflective of our values. And when we first went to school, we didn't come to school to learn how to harm people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Johnny, thank you. We are going to turn to Raphael in a second, but we're going to see you back here in a little bit for Q&A. To keep up with Johnny's work, follow him on Twitter at Mr. Johnny Perez. A quick reminder that if you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, please feel free to use the chat function to pose questions to any of our guests. You can also post questions on Twitter using the hashtag #PunishmentProfit. Our next guest is Rafael Sperry, architect, sustainable building consultant, and human rights advocate. He is the past president of Architects, Designers, Planners for Social Responsibility, where he continues to lead a national campaign to ban the design of spaces that violate human rights. He is also a board member of Designing Justice, Designing Spaces, the first architecture and real estate development firm dedicated to ending mass incarceration through building restorative alternatives, whose executive director we'll hear from later. Raphael, welcome to the show.
Thanks. It's an honor to be with you.
So, good design often reflects intended use of a space. So when it comes to prisons and jails, architects have historically worked closely with correctional administrators to design facilities that reflect dominant penological theory of the time. Tell us about this relationship between designers and corrections, and what are the priorities of correctional design today?
Yeah, so like you said, prison design is closely linked to operations of a building. It's like a hospital, where you need to understand how the owner is going to run it. Not so much like an apartment building where you don't know who's going to move in. And when you look at the history of prison design, it definitely reflects the changing ideas about what prison is supposed to be for in the United States. The overview of that is that there was prisons have been designed with good intentions at multiple points in the past, but they've always become places of violence and abuse. So the first example there in the top left corner is the Penitentiary. Like Johnny was describing, the first set of prisons that we had in the United States. They're called a penitentiary because the idea was that people would be penitent. They'd become religious and return to society. That was supposed to be achieved actually through solitary confinement with the Bible. After about 50 years of running these penitentiaries in the 19th century, Americans realized that they were dirty, dangerous, and disgraceful. And so there was a reform movement that brought in the Reformatory idea, which is in the top right corner there, which was run more like a disciplinary boot camp that was supposed to kind of give people a regimen that would make them a better worker when they returned to society. Again, by the 50 years later, dirty, dangerous, and disgraceful places. So that was replaced with the corrections idea down the bottom left. This were kind of nicer prisons that were based on a lot of social research. And that's kind of what you see today in Northern Europe. But in the United States, corrections ran into the prison uprisings of the 1960s that produced a clampdown. And what we have today are designs for containment and control, what you see in kind of the bottom right there, part of the tough on crime movement. So these designs don't even pretend to be nice places for people. In order to prevent uprisings, they've designed out spaces where people can gather in big groups. And the logical endpoint of that is solitary confinement, like what Johnny was talking about, where you remove every single social space. And that destroys basically society, because society is about people being together. And by destroying society, it also destroys individuals. It's a really destructive kind of space, and it's based on a push to minimize the number of staff people who can supervise the maximum number of people inside, because staffing a prison is really expensive. In order to minimize staffing, there's more use of video and technology, because Americans always believe that more technology can fix every problem. But really what it creates is a decrease in accountability and a failure to take even like basic humanitarian concerns into account.
Yeah, sadly, that makes sense, right? It's expensive, as you say, to operate the number of prisons and jails that we have in this country. It always blows my mind when I'm reminded that through much of the 80s and 90s, there was a prison being built every 8.5 days. What responsibility do architects and contractors have for the ballooning of incarceration and the abuse that happens inside the punishment infrastructure that they design and build? Are they really just service providers that are absolved of responsibility once they've turned over the keys to corrections?
Architects know what's going to happen when they design a building. Discussing how a prison is going to be run, that's part of the design process, just like we talk with any client about what they need and how we can give it to them. The problem with prison design is that architects are trying to solve the wrong problem. Prisons in this country are violent and abusive places because of the kind of fundamental racism and injustice that sends people there. And if you don't see that, then you're trying to stop the violence, which is a symptom, rather than addressing the root cause. And to me, that's a misuse of design. Here in the slide, you can see kind of an analogy between the prison design on the left and the safety toothbrush on the right, which is actually meant to be given to people in prisons. This toothbrush, if you can read it, it says it's an anti-shank design. So it's supposed to be not supposed to be able to be turned into a weapon, but it's also really dehumanizing to give a grown-up person a little toothbrush that you slip over your finger as if you were like brushing the teeth of a pet. Mm-hmm. And the design issue here is, if you're running a place where people are so desperate to attack each other that they're going to turn a toothbrush handle into a weapon, you have a bigger problem than the design of the toothbrush. In that situation, the designer's responsibility is to look up from the design of the toothbrush and spot the bigger problem all around you. Designing a prison for containment and control is just the same. We need to look up from the design of those buildings and see the real problem of mass incarceration and solve those problems. And that means changing our justice system and our broader society, not making nicer prisons.
Yeah, what I love about that example is that design is more than just design of buildings, of like large infrastructure, that there's actually design of things like equipment or supplies or these like little things, right? That, I mean, you know, a toothbrush that's really just a finger cover is not quite that, but you know, that is a different type of design. And I think that's super, we're going to talk more about things like equipment and supplies in future weeks, but really great to mention that now. Years ago, you launched a pledge for architects and designers to stop designing new prisons and jails that garnered over 1,000 signatures. As Johnny mentioned earlier, you also petitioned the American Institute of Architects to prohibit members from designing spaces of solitary confinement. Tell us about the successes and challenges of those campaigns and what opportunities for change you see on the horizon when it comes to architecture.
All right. So that first campaign you mentioned, we called the Prison Design Boycott for Alternatives to Incarceration. And we started it in 2003. And we've never really ended it because the United States is still building new prisons and jails when what we need is alternatives. But it was, I think, successful in the first couple of years that it ran. Our goal was to raise awareness because architecture is, as a profession, is really dominated by privileged white male people, and they're kind of cut off from a lot of the problems of mass incarceration that affect most Americans. So, bringing in this idea that people shouldn't design prisons at all changed the terms of the discussion. Because back in the 1990s, there was the conversation was: are we tough on crime, or are we going to like be nicer and design nicer jails? And we managed to change that conversation to, should we design prisons or should we not design prisons at all? And I think that was a real breakthrough for people to realize that there was a bigger conversation to be had, and even that the idea of prison abolition could be on the table. When we were running that campaign, one of the questions that people asked us a lot is, well, what are we supposed to do about, you know, the worst of the worst people who are out there, the mass murderers or whatever? And we want to flip that script on people and ask them, well, if you're concerned about the worst of the worst people, how about answering our concern about the worst of the worst prisons? And that led us to focus on solitary confinement and also execution chambers. And we launched a campaign that you mentioned to have the American Institute of Architects prohibit members from designing spaces for solitary and for execution. And it took 8 years, and we were rejected 3 separate times, but that campaign was actually incredibly successful. It started in 2012, asking for this change in the Code of Ethics, and AIA changed their Code of Ethics at the end of last year, exactly the way that we get asked. Wow. I think that's largely because of the Black Lives Matter protests that were kind of taking over the country last year. Also because AIA finally had somebody in leadership who was a little more sympathetic. So, you know, I'd say we learned some lessons from those 8 years of activism and the years before. Obviously, be persistent, take a while, but build your case and seize your moment. Because when the Black Lives Matter protest started, we were able to advance this idea of here's something you can do that we've been asking about for a long time. Now's the right time. And that message finally came through. In terms of like, what's the opportunity now? I think the opportunity now is with designing justice and designing spaces. And I know we're going to hear from Deanna Van Buren later. So the thing is, now we're not talking about making nicer prisons, but we're talking about making alternatives to prison. And every prison and jail has some space for solitary confinement in it, the way that Americans do it now. And that's a big obstacle to getting it built. So we need to demand alternatives to prisons and jails. And now we know how to design and build those alternatives.
Raphael, thank you. We're going to see you at the end of the show. And to follow Raphael's work, visit adpsr.org. Next, I want to invite Eunisses Hernandez to join us. Eunisses is the co-founder and co-executive director of La Defensa, which challenges punitive approaches to public safety and advances pre-trial policy reforms that shift power and funding into community hands. Her work has led to the repeal and reform of some of the most devastating tough on crime policies in California. And most recently, Eunisses helped lead the Justice LA coalition that successfully stopped a $3.5 billion jail expansion plan in Los Angeles County. Welcome, Eunisses.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me.
Hello. Okay, so everything we've been hearing, right, from Raphael is amazing. And then unfortunately, we know, as he said, that there are still many architects and contractors willing to design and build prisons and jails today. Some even have entire departments dedicated to the prison industry. But even after plans are drawn and ground is broken, there may still be room to stop a new facility from sprouting up. Eunisses, you led a massive fight that did just that in Los Angeles in the face of opposition from major industry titans like McCarthy building companies. Tell us about that fight, the fight that Justice LA waged to stop jail construction last year, and what was it that made that campaign successful?
Thank you for that question. I'm gonna go quickly. I have 5 points that I want to bring up around this. One, it was a long intergenerational fight. It took generations of organizers, nearly a decade, to stop LA County's jail plan, right? Its expansion plan. They wanted to build 2 new jails. So that's point one. Point two is we technically lost. Contracts were signed and with companies like McCarthy, who were getting paid up to $7 million a month to draw out these jail plans, essentially. So we were at a point where those contracts were signed. They were about to break ground. They identified it, everything. Also, the third point is that their plan was to build 2 new jails, a jail for women over 50 miles away from the city of LA in the middle of nowhere on toxic soil with valley fever. And then they wanted to build a jail in Chinatown in downtown LA for people who have behavioral health needs and mental health needs. And so at all of that, the starting cost was $3.5 billion. And so that's where we were at. We figured, the fourth point is that we had to figure that we had to attack this jail plan from different points. So in order to stop jail expansion, how do we, one, decarcerate the jail population? In LA County, we had about 17,000 people average every day in the jail. Over 6,000 of them pre-trial because they can't pay to get out for their bail or because of the harsh pre-trial policies that exist. And also a significant amount of women in LA County were there for acts that were driven by poverty, mental health, unmet behavioral health needs. And so we knew that if we want to stop jail expansion, how do we decarcerate the pre-trial population? So our coalition, and I didn't lead it, I was a part of this amazing group that is a part of that's made up of people like Yvette Allais from Dignity and Power Now, Mark Anthony Claim Johnson from Frontline Wellness Network, Blake Stepling, and many others. But we broke out our coalition into different work groups. And also to say, I think that one of the biggest pieces why we were successful is because we were led by people who are directly impacted and their loved ones. They're the ones that the leading, how we're strategizing that campaign, who we're reaching out to, and that's very important for us to uplift. And we never compromise. We always make sure that we don't leave people behind, and no time in the jail fight, even when they were like, how about we do only 2,000 beds instead of 4,000, did we waver to that? So just want to say those 2 things. But so our work groups were broken up around pre-trial advocacy. One was anti-construction advocacy, to figure out how we work with the unions. How do we work to get the credibility out of McCarthy? And we also had alternatives to incarceration work group and many spaces like that. And so it was in our anti-construction work group that we figured out we needed to build with the construction unions, that we needed to show people what McCarthy was like. Look, they're building other jails and prisons across the state that people are dying in that are supposed to be hospitals. So that's where we did that. And different strategies that tackle different parts of that jail plan to tear it down, to tear the need for those beds down, or the reasons why they wanted to build these beds, right? Like, you don't need to be incarcerating Black women at disproportionate rates, at astronomical rates, right? Just because they can't, just because they have stolen property or they have drug paraphernalia on them. And that's something I want to uplift as well, that $1 million hoods, though that research really helped change the political landscape. Last piece is that the sheriff, we had a new sheriff during this jail fight that really took away the credibility from the sheriff's department. One of the reasons why it took so long to cancel the contract was because we had politically savvy sheriffs saying, I need 4,800 new jail beds. This new sheriff came in, I can talk about him all day, but he just wasn't politically savvy and it reduced their credibility.
That's so interesting. Actually, I'm going to follow up on something real quick. Can you talk for just a second about how McCarthy actually showed up? Like, what did they try to do? How did they try to push back on your fight?
It was in the background, with the CEO's office, the chief executive office. That's what we found in our analysis, that it's not just the people in government in power, like the board of supervisors, but it's these other backdoor departments like the chief executive office, who are the ones working directly with the companies, putting out the RFPs. And so they didn't really have an outside strategy. They were kind of hidden. It wasn't until Reform LA Jails really uplifted, like, look what they have done across the state, that we were able to profile them like they're bad actors. But it was really the unions who were against us, the construction unions that were against us in the beginning. But later on, they came on board because we're like, look, we're not anti-construction. We're just saying you don't need to build thousands of new jail beds. How about build some alternative spaces for our community? So that's, MacArthur was trying to hide, but we uplifted them.
That's so brilliant, and actually leads me into this next thought. So we know that Los Angeles is not the only community that is facing prison and jail expansion now or in recent years. You and your partners at CURB have several initiatives and resources out to help others fight prison and jail construction in their communities. Can you tell us about those efforts? And there was a quote that I read in one of those guides that I think actually speaks a lot to what you were just talking about, but it reads, "A prison will help almost no one and will harm many. Almost everyone is a potential ally in your fight." Talk to us about that.
Yeah, so, California is quote unquote like progressive in that is often uplifted as a progressive state, but we're cleaning up a lot of the mess that was happening in the 80s and 90s with the prison jail and jail boom, especially the new jail boom that arrived in 2011 with California realignment. So we're in a state where we have a lot of prisons. More prisons were built than colleges at one point. And so we have people like Decarcerate Sacramento fighting jail expansion in the city of Sacramento and the county there, really uplifting the need of, you can't get well in a cell. Pretty much. And, that has really been transported across the state because we've seen in other jurisdictions as mental health needs being a reason to incarcerate people. You see people in Orange County, right? A conservative place, but transforming justice out there, stopping jail expansion there with the music, jail that they want to build. Also, CURB has put out, several reports around closing down the 12 oldest prisons in California. Now the governor's, looking to close 2 prisons in the next couple of years. So that has been really transformative. There's been a lot of work around that. And then that quote, people can digest it how they'd like, but I really think it speaks to coalition building and how more people would benefit with not having jails. You just have to find the right messaging for that group. Just like we did with the unions, brought them on board. Just like we did with community members saying, look, we have a plan to build out alternatives. It doesn't need to look like jail cells. It could be, housing. It could be permanent housing, affordable housing, all the things, right? So that's really what that quote speaks to me, that you can get more people on board to support things that will help the communities thrive. And that will always outweigh and outwin this messaging of like, this jail is going to bring new jobs. It's going to bring a whole economy, because we've seen how that just falls through and more people get harmed in the end because people get sick at the jails, even the employees and people in the prisons, like no one benefits. So that's how that speaks to me. Coalition building based on values and not leaving people behind.
Yeah, I love that. I think so often we talk about, organizing even with correctional staff to say like, these are not actually good jobs. Like when you're trying to build these into your community, like these are not actually the jobs that you want. Thank you so much, Eunisses. To keep up with Eunisses' work, follow La Defensa and Justice LA Now on Twitter. We'd like to remind everyone that you can share questions in the chat on YouTube or on Facebook, or by using the hashtag punishmentprofit on Twitter. We'll be taking your questions at the end of the program. Our final guest today is Deanna Van Buren, one of just 500 Black female architects in the U.S. and the co-founder and executive director of Designing Justice, Designing Spaces, a nonprofit architecture and real estate development firm that uses community engagement, evidence-based research, and design for peacemaking and reparation to end mass incarceration and structural inequity. Across the country, Deanna has created multi-use centers for restorative justice and workforce development. Deanna, welcome.
Thank you, Bianca. And I just want to say I'm one of 500 Black female licensed architects. Thank God there's a few more than 500, but not many of us are licensed, unfortunately.
Thank you for that. Deanna, I always say that prison abolition is not just about demolition. It's also about building things in the place of our carceral infrastructure. Sometimes we forget about that critical second piece, the building. But I love your work so much because it focuses squarely on it. In prior conversations, you've told me that it starts with decolonizing design. Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, of course. So I think we've heard from all the folks on the panel in this beautiful way about the way the built environment has really been kind of weaponized against Black and Brown communities. And so what this means is we're at a place of like radical reimagination of justice, right? Reimagining the processes, the policies, but also the built environment. I didn't imagine this crap, right? This is not my imagination that's manifested this. So in order to do that, right, in order to engage in that process, we've got to make sure that our language, our tools, our processes are accessible to systems impacted folks in their communities of care. This to us is a process of democratizing design, right? It's not for the elite. I'm not working for elite government institutions or wealthy people. I'm working for my own people, my own community, and helping them to think about this and understand how the built environment happens, right? How does it get financed? Why does it look this way? And how can we reimagine something completely different that addresses the root causes of this system?
So what's clear is that liberation is not about designing prettier prisons. We've heard Raphael say that, and I think Johnny's work and Eunisses' work certainly also elevates that. And just thinking about what designing for healing, reparations, and care could look like is itself liberating, right? But like you said, you don't design in a vacuum. Can you give us a few examples of what your community engagement process looks like and what structures it has produced?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the democratization of design is tied to that, right? That if we're going to work with communities to reimagine the future, right, of our neighborhoods, of justice altogether, we have to teach them what we know, right? And so our process really involves developing a whole range of tools. It's very robust, right? It's a co-learning process. I want you to know the tools that I use as an architect, because it's not rocket science. I can teach you how to do that. And together, we're going to reimagine in sort of creative processes, right? This helps open up our minds into a form of elastic thinking. And this is everything from doing like full-scale mock-ups of an idea to ecosystem mapping. We do a space and finance game, right? Where you're doing space planning with game pieces and then throwing chips and starting to figure out how you're going to pay for your amazing design, right? So I understand the financials. This is an image you see of our coming to the table game or process. It's like a kitchen table that you can come up to, and it's got the model of the building on it, and you can play with blocks and add your ideas and create a kind of a menu of concepts. So it's very creative. It's very robust. And out of that, we're able to code and analyze that data and come up with concepts like our pop-up village, right? The pop-up resource village came out of community in a long community engagement process. So it's like a village on wheels, never been done before, right? A women's mobile refuge trailer. I worked with about 60 women in a San Francisco jail to imagine what does a mobile refuge for women look like, right? And we were able to create that space, and it's out on right now supporting unhoused women. Mobile refuge rooms for folks coming home from prison and jail. We did mock-ups with them and we designed those together. So that process is critical because you ain't going to get the right result if you don't engage folks who it's for, right, and exchange their knowledge with yours.
Yep. the end of the day, they'll be in that space, right? It's the community.
The space, yeah. Why would I do that without them? Doesn't make any sense. And that's just the way architecture's been practiced up till now, right? The prisons Raphael showed, right? Those didn't engage folks. That was like somebody up high is like, oh, I think this is the great idea and how we should do it, right? It's a disaster. It's a disaster.
So to close us out, Deanna, this part of the program, when you imagine a world without prisons or jails, what does it look like? What have
I imagine it every day. Yeah, it's like so much stuff.
What have we built in there?
It's endless. It's endless. I mean, Eunisses is leading, and the whole Justice LA coalition is looking at a decentralized system of behavioral healthcare that's holistic, right? Integrated. This is a distributed network of restorative justice centers and de-escalation centers rather than building police stations. These are spaces for survivors of violence. We're working on those right now. This is an image of the Love Campus, right? Multi-use, multi-tenant, community-owned resource hubs, right? Where people can come to gather supporting social cohesion, right? I know my neighbor, right? I'm interconnected, right? This is what keeps us truly safe, and that the community owns these places at every level, right? So it's theirs. You can't take that away from them. And I've actually working in our firm to build an entire database of 8 categories of infrastructure that has to be built to end mass incarceration, and an associative tool that allows you to plan your community, right? What does my neighborhood look like without mass incarceration and the police state as we know it? And here's all the constellation of infrastructure that we need to build in order to make that happen, showing real case studies. It's really happening and it can be done. And we will not need to be building prisons and jails. We've got to stop investing in that infrastructure.
Deanna, I love your work. I get so excited when I think about like design. I think some of my own artistic juices are running, but I'm like, it's so fun to like be like, let's build this. Let's really build this together and build something different from what we have.
Totally. Absolutely.
Deanna, thank you. To follow Deanna's work at Designing Justice, Designing Spaces, visit designingjustice.org and sign up for their mailing list. And now we're going to bring up all of our guests, bring them back to answer some of the audience questions that we're seeing coming in on YouTube and on Facebook. So welcome back, folks. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. And I'm sort of filtering through these questions. And I think there's one that's really interesting here. I'm going to pose this one to Raphael, if I can. And the question is about carceral feeling spaces in places outside of just corrections. And so is there any work being done? Is there a movement around architecture and changing or eradicating the carceral feeling beyond just prisons, jails, and ICE detention centers, but things like in schools or in hospitals, where we are seeing also carceral infrastructure sort of invading those spaces?
Oh, what a good question. I'm glad that our audience is thinking about things like this. I think there's kind of 2 movements that are trying to address that. One is community design, broadly considered, which includes a lot of the work that Deanna, Designing Justice, Design Spaces does. And another one is biophilic design. So community design is a process where architecturally have to set aside their kind of pretension to be the experts and that they know what people need. And you actually approach the people who are going to be there and try and understand what they need person to person as humans, and then start designing on that basis. I think the reason that you see a lot of public housing and even public schools that kind of feel like prisons is that the bureaucracy that calls for those, the school district and the public housing authorities, aren't actually serving as an interface where they bring their occupants, the students, the teachers, the residents into the design process. Instead, they step into for those people and they don't actually understand their needs. And then what you get is an architecture firm that's used to working with a big bureaucracy, which is a really different specialization than one that's used to working with everyday people. And it's actually some of the same firms. Once you know how to work with a county sheriff's office, you can learn how to work with a local school district a lot easier. So we need to break that chain and try and have people work with people. Biophilic design is a more broad movement, which is about bringing nature into spaces and kind of working with the patterns and forms of nature. And I think that's also quite optimistic in terms of kind of what the design field might have to offer people.
I love that. And actually, Raphael, I think you and I have spoken about some of those ideas before, and thinking about how to like actually break down that carceral thought in sort of other spaces. I'm going to pose, and that question was from Bree Price on YouTube. So thank you for your question. The next question I'm going to pose to Deanna, a question to you from Chris Leach on YouTube. And the question is, oh, excuse me. I'm going to take that back. Chris, we'll get back to your question. Jerry Weinstein, I'd like to pose this question to you, Deanna, from YouTube, which is for your community engagement projects. Now with COVID, we're all in a virtual world. Otherwise, we'd be sitting in a studio or on stage somewhere. Are you thinking about digital versions of these games to get the community involved and still be part of these design processes?
That was half of my last year, my friend. Immediately, we had to digitize the tools in the game. So we are running workshops as we speak in Miro, which is a whiteboard software. We use Apple pencils and pads to sketch so that we, right now, for example, working with survivors of homicide to imagine spaces for survivors of severe violence. We're doing interviews with them. They're visualizing, so we're able to listen to them. They can see in real time the designs emerging out of their ideas. If they can get access to it, which sometimes they can, they use the Miro board for that. We also have a designer on deck program where local folks are doing community engagement on the ground as best they can in a social distance manner. We have done socially distanced small workshops in person last summer. But yes, primarily we're working through this environment, and it's going pretty well.
Thank you. Okay, so the next question I'm going to pose to Eunisses. This is from Chris Leach on YouTube. Are prisons being retrofitted to minimize the spread of COVID?
It's impossible to social distance inside of a jail and a prison. If they're being retrofitted to cage people who have behavioral health needs, which will suck up even more resources to provide quote unquote healthcare in these places. So no, they're not getting retrofitted. We're hearing stories of guards not even wearing masks, sheriffs in LA County not wearing masks in the jails. And so they don't care about the people. They're not taking the necessary precautions to protect people in there. Like in LA County, they have 3-layered bunk beds called, coffins. So they're not going to spend their money on that. They don't care about the people, if I could be candid. That's what we've seen in our experience.
Thanks, Eunisses. I'm actually going to let Johnny weigh in on that question too, but before I'm going to add a second question into that, Johnny. There's some questions about solitary and where there might be active bills to end solitary. This question is from Rebecca Lipsitch on YouTube. And I think you can, in some senses think about those things together, that we're actually seeing an expansion of solitary, right, during COVID-19. Can you talk about are facilities doing anything to change the infrastructure during COVID? And how might that be impacting and how is that impacting solitary confinement work?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that, most of the money on prisons is spent on finding ways to keep people inside of a cell, keep them locked in. They're not spent on things that humanize you. And because we've been married to this idea of punishment for so long, that same idea is now created a space where it's debilitating for the people that are there. They're, to Eunisses' point, they're not even prioritizing the health of the people that are there now. I'll take a place like, let's say Delaware, I forget the name of the facility. I remember walking in and doing a tour and they were holding, reentry facilitating classes inside of a gym separated by a shower curtain, almost impossible, lack of resources, et cetera. And when they do get resources, they don't end up getting dedicated to those things. And speaking about tying it into legislation and active legislation, many of the campaigns across 15 different states all have active legislation to end the torture of solitary confinement. And most of the bills are asking for three specific things, right? One, to meet international standards by limiting the use of solitary confinement, not placing people in these spaces no more than 15 days. There's times when folks need to be separated from the population, we don't necessarily need to be isolated. And the United Nations deemed anything over 15 days to be considered torture, because that is the point at which there's irreversible mental health consequences, psychological consequences. It also excludes the most vulnerable for being placed in it even for 15 days. That is the most elderly, folks who are young people, people with mental health concerns, women who are expecting. Unfortunately, we live in a country that places women who are expecting in solitary. And then lastly, it answers the question around alternatives. If not solitary, then what, you know? And many of the bills ask for what's called residential rehabilitation units, where people get more time out of their cell. People have access to treatment, like substance abuse treatment, anger management, et cetera, and are in a better placed position to be able to re-enter. The issue is that there's people, who are there now, while they're there, like we have to ask the question at the same time that we break these prisons down. And shout out to Eunisses and your work there, and all the folks she mentioned, and other people, in our movement, working to close down these prisons, and at the same time paying attention to the folks that are there now. Like, well, how do we protect, those folks that are there now when solitary is the most extreme, weaponized architecture that I've personally experienced? But yeah.
Thank you, Johnny. So the next question is one for sort of Deanna and Raphael to maybe take together. This is from Thalia Faye on YouTube. How can incoming architecture students divest from and resist carceral design in our education, training, and careers?
Wow. Good question. I think a good place to start would be to try and learn about the history and architecture of cultures outside of the kind of dominant white Euro-American architecture history that's usually taught. Because that architecture history comes with the history of colonialism and a kind of mindset that often kind of accepts or even is part of white supremacy. So learning about how people have built in Africa, in South America, indigenous communities in the United States, people from other cultures have really different ways of responding to the harms in society that we call crime. And if you kind of understand the alternatives, it's not that somebody else has the answer for us, but we're trying to liberate ourselves from a past that's pretty difficult, and just widening your horizons and understanding that other people have history that's just as important and in fact really valuable. It's probably a good place to start if you're a student. So good luck with that.
And I can build on that. I mean, you need to rise up. And we're seeing student groups in universities across the country who are rising up, right? We're seeing things like free school being created down in LA. We're seeing students at Harvard's Graduate School of Design conferences called Black in Design and pushing the curriculum. Like, you need to put this on the reading list, right? You need to start to include this kind of curriculum at the school. So you're gonna have to fight a bit, right? You can't sit back and accept the curriculum that is being presented to you. I remember as a student talking to my dean and like, I don't want to design cities in China. I've never been to China. I'm not Chinese. I'm right near Harlem. Why can't we work in the communities that we're in? Work with those folks. So you have to ask, you have to push, propose your own studio, right? That you want to do. We are seeing some of that happening. So I really advocate for students fighting for the kind of education they want to have.
Thank you. So this next question, or sort of bundle of questions, since we've gotten a few, I'm going to throw towards Johnny and Eunisses, and it's about closed Rikers and, just the idea of, building sort of new facilities in cities, and interested in getting both of your thoughts. And so from Alendre Lindor on YouTube, what do you think about Rikers closing and the 5 borough prisons instead? Is that good or bad? From another interested party on YouTube, what is the recommendation to stop the enlargement of New York's borough-based jails as the city's response to Rikers? Are these city-based jails really the right response? Is there a fear that we're going to recreate the issues at Rikers into these facilities?
Johnny, you're from the East Coast. You want to get it started? Because I have my thoughts, but please take it away.
So yeah, I have my thoughts too. And I say this, as a person who, has actually lived in these facilities, visited these facilities, and then at the very early of the campaign to end close Rikers was involved, and then I moved into this role. But I'll say this, one, there's a misconception about this idea of replacing Rikers with something else. I think that the premise of that question is malinformed, and that there is not a replacement, and there's a contraction of the system, if you will. New York City goes from 17,000 beds to 3,500 beds. And then the question does ask, like I mentioned yesterday in the Brian Laura show, if Rikers closes on Monday, is the NYPD going to continue arresting and placing people inside of these facilities on Tuesday? And if the answer is yes, then we have to take a look at what do these spaces currently look at, and how can we rethink about what these spaces look like, including all of the things that Raphael and both Deanna said, including the community and what these spaces look like, who should have access to it, who should be there. Now, I tend to be a skeptic, because there's times when, like, for example, years ago, I wrote a piece in the Daily News, talking about transferring correctional officers from one facility to another, and how we really have to think beyond just the architecture, but really look at, the operating procedures, the manuals, who's actually at these facilities. We need more public health folks versus more correctional officers, et cetera. So lastly, I guess my finishing thought is that, if folks are going to be in these spaces, right, we can do both. We can work to shrink the system, while at the same time paying attention to how folks are treated there. And I'll end with, Khalif Rada's story, right? Like, not where he was literally held on Rikers Island for 3 years straight for something he didn't even do, and in these conditions. Not to say that is the end all be all, but if we think that people can go to jail and prison and be traumatized, not fed, abused, kicked down the steps periodically, have their dreads pulled out, and then, hey, just go back into society like everything's fine, then we're literally spinning our wheels on what we think abolition is, what we think ending mass incarceration is, if we think that we can focus on everything outside of what's happening there now. And it's a dangerous place to be in, both as a movement and also how we navigate the work, and what are the policy changes that we look for, and how we ultimately protect the people that we care about.
Yeah, before Eunisses, I have you jump in, I'm gonna add in another question and some context. So, Johnny, you talked about how there is a significant decline in order for closed Rikers to even happen, right? There had to be a really substantial decline in the number of people that were incarcerated. So we had to see significant decarceration. We're looking at 3,500 people in those facilities today, or to get to that, the quote unquote community borough plan, which was a system that held 21,000 people back in the 1990s. So that is a considerable, obviously decarceral effort. But then there's still this struggle that I think many of us have, especially within the abolition movement, about erecting a new building that is going to incarcerate people. And so I'm going to add, before I turn it over to you, Eunisses, Victoria Scott from our Fellows program, actually, for the curriculum course here, is asking also, do you think that efforts towards reforming prison spaces, for the time being, these sort of efforts to either erect new places or rehab old facilities, can pose harm or create roadblocks towards the movement for abolition?
So I'll start off with the first question about the plan. We look to you all. LA County pre-COVID, we had a general, average daily jail population about 17,000, and you all reduced it to less than 4,000 right at some point. And that's what we want to aim for. That's what we talk about, in LA. Like, we need to get to that point if we even want to have a conversation about what kind of facilities we don't need or need at all. What I will say is that if they build it, they will fill it. A jail is a jail is a jail, no matter what kind of name you put on it. That has been our experience here. And so also, last thing I want to mention is that nothing is impossible. We were advised many times by the bureaucracy that what you're trying to do is impossible. The contracts are signed, millions of dollars have been spent. Like, what do you think you're trying to do? And so that's what I'll say to that I think that they're still in a place where, they need to challenge themselves. And I know that there's a lot of issues on that particular project, but I think there's a lot of opportunity. And I would hate to see jails be built, because they will fill them. I think around the piece of them being built and eradicated, or them standing up, is that There's two examples. In my neighborhood, there's an old jail that's been closed down, just there, asbestos rotting away. But on the other hand, there's a place in South Central LA where they've transformed a probation courthouse into a community center and free high school for youth who have been kicked out of regular schools. There's community-based organizations, there are service providers. And so, I just want to uplift that piece that it could go two ways. We could reclaim what exists that's livable, that's usable, but not just because we can reclaim those things means that we should build them. For us, the Values of Justice LA is that if we're moving in a way that's leaving anybody behind, building something we'll have to destroy in the future, or giving more power, more resources to the system, then that's not the direction that we're going to move in, because it's harder work to reverse that.
Yes. So this is a question for anyone who wants to step in. This is a question about sort of the gender of facilities. And so the Ruth Lane question is curious to hear about how these designs, the solitary aspects, the gender of facilities intersects with the oppression along gender lines, and specifically the experience of trans and gender non-conforming folks. Go ahead, Johnny.
Well, I was going to say, what we've seen in terms of solitary, we've seen that that trans folks are actually placed in solitary confinement, not because of what they've done, but because of who they simply are. Just arriving at a facility, automatically correctional officers will place people in administrative segregation or straight up in solitary for, quote unquote, for their own safety. But we find that these folks are literally just being punished at a higher rate than the general population.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Raphael.
I just add that prisons are the most gendered built institution in our society. It's like there's one building for men and a whole different campus in a different place for women. And it just kind of shows that logic of containment and control and kind of male domination in this case. And when you find people who challenge that logic, they simply don't fit. And that, right now it's that they suffer intensely, like Johnny was saying. But I think that's another reason that we need alternatives. When you have places that are more open to we're here to help solve people's behavioral health problems, they're not going to turn you away or fail you because you don't fit into the simple boxes of male or female. So we need to be thinking inclusively, and prisons are the opposite of that.
Yeah, I think that's, there are so many issues, right, in our society where we realize, or so many reasons in our society where we realize prisons can't fix this, right? There's no way to design prisons in a way where that isn't going to be true in many ways, at least in the archaic and penological thinking that we have now. And so the only solution, right, is abolition. That becomes the solution, is decarceration and people not going into those spaces and building the alternatives that we need. So that's all we have time for today. I want to thank our guests so much for joining us tonight. Johnny, Raphael, Eunisses, and Deanna. I want to thank everyone at home for joining us and for your questions and for your engagement. We'll be back next week at the same time, Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern, to talk about operations and management in the prison industry. That is everyone's favorite subject, private prisons. For those who want to keep tonight's conversation going, to ask more questions or share your reflections, join me and Rena Karifa Johnson, Director of Campaigns and Advocacy at SE Justice Group, as we head over to Clubhouse for our public study group. Follow me at Bianca Tylek to find the room. If you'd like to learn more about our work at Worth Rises, please check us out at worthrises.org and follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Worth Rises. I'm Bianca Tylek. Good night.